The content presented in this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. The narratives discussed are based on historical cases, generally 40 years or older, using publicly available information, reconstructed storytelling, and interpretive analysis. While care is taken to present events accurately, certain elements may be condensed, adapted, or presented for narrative clarity. The psychological insights and analyses offered are speculative in nature and do not constitute formal diagnoses, clinical evaluations, or definitive conclusions about any individual's mental state, intent, or behavior. This podcast does not provide medical, psychological, or legal advice. Listeners should not substitute any information presented here for professional consultation with qualified practitioners. All views expressed are intended to explore patterns of human behavior and decision-making, not to assign guilt, establish fact, or replace official findings. Listener discretion is advised. You're listening to The Missing Why. People will tell you what they did. Some will even tell you how they did it. But the why is almost always edited or buried, because the real reasons are rarely clean. They're shaped by fear, by ambition, by ego, by pressure that never makes it into the story. Every decision leaves a trace. Every action exposes a pattern. And most people spend their lives hoping no one looks closely enough to connect them. This is where we do. We study the fracture points, the contradictions, the quiet motives operating behind composed language and controlled appearances. Because beneath every polished narrative, there is something else. And once you see it, you don't unsee it. There are crimes that frighten a city because of what happened. And then there are crimes that frighten a city because of what they make the city do. New Orleans was already a city of sound. Streetcars, church bells, river traffic, footsteps on damp pavement, voices spilling from doorways, and underneath all of it, music. Jazz was not just entertainment there. It was atmosphere. It was breath. It was the sound of a city with too much life to stay quiet. But in 1919, jazz became something else. A shield, a ritual, a bargain with death. Because somewhere in New Orleans, someone had been entering homes at night. Not always with a weapon brought from outside. Sometimes the weapon was already there. An axe, a hatchet, a tool of the household, a tool of labor, a thing meant to split wood, repair property, maintain ordinary life. And that is part of what made the Axeman terrifying. He did not merely bring violence into the home. He turned the home against itself then. came the letter, a voice claiming to be from hell, a voice claiming it could not be caught, a voice that did not simply threaten one person or one family or one neighborhood. It threatened the city, and it gave the city instructions: play jazz or get the axe. And on that night, New Orleans played, not because everyone believed the letter, not because everyone believed the killer was real, but because fear does not require certainty. Fear only requires possibility. Tonight, we examine the Axeman of New Orleans, not as a monster from folklore, not as a ghost from a haunted tour, but as a psychological event, a case where violence became theater, where uncertainty became power, where a city was manipulated by a voice that may or may not have belonged to the killer, and where the real weapon may not have been the axe at all. The real weapon may have been obedience. This is the missing why. The Axeman of New Orleans remains one of the most disturbing unsolved crime stories in American history. Between 1918 and 1919, New Orleans was gripped by a series of violent nighttime attacks. Many victims were Italian or Sicilian grocers. Several were attacked inside their homes or attached living quarters. The attacker often used an axe or hatchet, sometimes one found at the scene itself. The killer was never conclusively identified. But the reason this case remains psychologically immortal is not only because of the murders, it is because of the performance, the letter, the demand, the jazz. This case forces us to confront a deeper question. What happens when fear becomes organized? Panic, not private grief. Organized fear, fear with instructions, fear with timing, fear with ritual, fear that makes people change their behavior before the next attack even happens. That is where the Axeman becomes more than a killer. He becomes a psychological system. To understand the Axeman, we have to understand the city. New Orleans in 1918 was not merely a location. It was a pressure chamber. It was a city shaped by race, migration, class division, organized crime, religious symbolism, old world identities, new world survival, and intense neighborhood life. Many of the victims were connected to grocery stores, especially Italian and Sicilian immigrant communities. That matters. Grocery was not just a business, it was a household economy, a community node, a place where money, family, labor, food, credit, reputation, and vulnerability were all tied together. For immigrant families, the store often represented survival. It was visible proof that the family had entered the American economy. So when violence entered those spaces, it was not only attacking bodies, it was attacking aspiration. It was attacking the fragile architecture of immigrant stability. That is why the Axeman case feels different from ordinary street violence. The attacks did not happen in alleyways alone. They breached thresholds, bedrooms, back rooms, private quarters, the places where people stopped performing public strength and became defenseless. Psychologically, this is crucial. A home is not just shelter. A home is a place where the nervous system lowers its guard. When violence enters that space during sleep, it creates a distinct kind of terror, not the fear of confrontation, the fear of helplessness, the fear that the boundary between outside danger and inside safety was always imaginary. The Axeman attacks were not clean in the way fictional crime often appears clean. They were chaotic, bloody, confusing, inconsistent enough to create doubt, but consistent enough to create a pattern. That is part of why the case became psychologically powerful. If a killer has a clear motive, society can place the crime inside a box. Robbery, revenge, jealousy, gang conflict, domestic violence. But the Axeman resisted containment. Some scenes suggested forced entry. Some suggested the attacker knew how to exploit the structure of the home. Some victims survived. Some died. Some attacks involved grocers. Some involved families. Some were connected by method. Others by atmosphere. And that ambiguity became the engine of fear, because the human mind can tolerate danger better than uncertainty. Danger says, here is the threat. Uncertainty says, the threat could be anywhere. That distinction matters. The Axeman did not only produce death, he produced interpretive collapse. People could not agree on what he was: a serial killer, a racialized threat, a mafia-related enforcer, a madman, a thief, a supernatural figure, a newspaper invention, a copycat, a publicity stunt, a myth built on real bodies. When a society cannot identify the structure of a threat, it begins to invent one. That is how fear becomes folklore. One of the most psychologically disturbing elements of the Axeman case is the use of ordinary tools. An axe is not inherently strange in the early 20th century. A hatchet is not exotic. These were practical objects, common objects, objects already embedded in domestic and commercial life. That is what makes them terrifying in this context. The Axeman did not need the symbolic distance of a gun. The axe is intimate, physical, primitive. It requires proximity. It requires bodily commitment. It is not merely an instrument of killing. It is an instrument of domination. A gun can preserve distance between offender and victim. An axe collapses the distance. The offender must enter the space, approach the body, raise the weapon, strike. Creates a different psychological profile of violence, not necessarily more emotional, but more embodied, more intrusive, more violating. And if the weapon came from the victim's own property, the symbolism becomes even darker. The killer is not just entering your home. He is using your own environment against you, your tool, your structure, your domestic order, your life. This is one of the central psychological signatures of the Axeman case. The ordinary becomes hostile. The house becomes permeable. The object becomes predatory. The familiar becomes unsafe. That is why cases like this linger, because they do not merely ask, who killed them? They ask, safety ever real? Then came the letter. The letter is the psychological center of the Axeman story. Not because we know it came from the killer. We do not know that with certainty. That uncertainty is part of its power. The writer claimed to be unlike ordinary men. He claimed supernatural association. He mocked law enforcement. He suggested that he would return at a specific time, and then he gave New Orleans a condition: jazz must be playing. The writer declared that homes where jazz was being played would be spared. That demand transformed the case. For the letter, the Axeman was a hidden threat. After the letter, the Axeman became a director. He was no longer simply moving through the city. He was making the city move. That is the difference between violence and psychological control. Violence changes bodies. Control changes behavior. The letter did not need to kill anyone to work. It only needed to be believed enough. That phrase matters. Believed enough. Most social control does not require total belief. It requires partial belief under pressure. A person may say, this is probably fake, but then they imagine the alternative. What if it is not? What if I am wrong? What if silence is the thing that marks my house? That is how coercive uncertainty works. It forces the victim to participate in their own fear management. And on the night named in the letter, New Orleans reportedly filled with jazz. Bands played, homes played music, people gathered. Some may have mocked the threat, some may have enjoyed the absurdity, some may have been genuinely afraid. But beneath the surface, the psychological fact remains: the city responded. A letter reorganized behavior. That is why this case is not merely historical. It is a study in mass compliance under symbolic threat. The jazz demand is what makes the Axeman case almost surreal. But psychologically, it is not random. Jazz in New Orleans carried cultural meaning. It was alive, improvisational, associated with nightlife, black musicianship, working class spaces, vice districts, pleasure, rebellion, and urban energy. To demand jazz was not simply demand music. It was to demand participation in a ritual. The writer chose something public enough to be heard, but private enough to enter the home. That is brilliant in a disturbing way. He did not say, leave a candle in the window. He did not say, put a mark on your door. He demanded sound. Sound travels. Sound announces compliance. Sound lets neighbors know who is participating. Sound turns private fear into public atmosphere. And this is where the mind bender begins. If the letter was from the killer, then the Axeman understood psychological theater. If the letter was not from the killer, then someone else understood the city well enough to hijack fear and turn it into performance. Either way, the psychological mechanism is the same. The city became the stage. The killer, or the writer, became the unseen author. Jazz became the ritual of survival. That night, the absence of music may have felt like exposure. Silence becomes dangerous. Think about that. A city famous for sound was taught to fear silence. That is the kind of symbolic inversion the missing Y is built to examine. The Axeman did not just threaten death. He changed the meaning of quiet. We have to be careful here. We are not diagnosing the Axeman. We do not know who he was, but we can examine the behavioral architecture. The offender, or the person behind the letter, appears to operate through several psychological mechanisms. First, intrusion. He violates the boundary of the home. Second, proximity. He attacks at close range, often when victims are vulnerable. Third, ambiguity. The motive remains unclear, which increases public fear. Fourth, symbolic escalation. The letter expands the crime from individual victims to the entire city. Fifth, theatrical control. The jazz demand makes the public participate in the offender's imagined authority. This is why the Axeman is psychologically distinct. Many offenders seek concealment. The Axeman myth sought atmosphere. The person may have hidden physically, but the persona became visible everywhere. That is a powerful distinction. The body disappears. The idea spreads. The killer is not in every house, but the fear is. And once fear spreads, it does some of the offender's work for him. People check locks. People whisper. People suspect neighbors. People replay sounds at night. People imagine footsteps. People reinterpret every creak, every shadow, every unknown figure. Fear becomes self-generating. That is the genius of terror systems. They do not need constant action. They only need intermittent proof. One attack, then silence. Another attack, then rumor, then a letter, then music, then nothing. The unpredictability is the structure. In most crime stories, we focus on the individual victims. We should. They were real people. Their suffering should not be converted into entertainment. But in the Axeman case, there is also a second victim, the city itself. New Orleans was not killed, but it was psychologically entered. The same way the offender entered homes, the Axeman myth entered the city's nervous system. That is why this case still lives. The Axeman became part of New Orleans mythology because the case fused violence with identity, murder, jazz, night, immigrant neighborhoods, newspaper spectacle, supernatural language, unsolved mystery. That combination is almost impossible for a culture to forget. And this is where we have to be precise. A myth can preserve memory, but a myth can also distort it. The Axeman becomes a character. The victims become background. The jazz threat becomes the headline. The human cost becomes atmosphere. That is dangerous because when crime becomes folklore, the offender can become more vivid than the people harmed. So our job is not to romanticize the Axeman. Our job is to dissect the mechanism. The Axeman story survives because it attached itself to something larger than murder. It attached itself to the fear that society is always one unexplained threat away from ritual obedience. That is the real horror, not simply that a killer existed, but that a city could be made to dance around the possibility of him. So, what is the psychological structure here? For the missing why this case falls under fear preservation through theatrical control. The baseline environment, a dense, culturally rich, socially stratified city with immigrant communities, neighborhood economies, racial and class tension, and public fascination with crime. The disruption, nighttime attacks inside homes and businesses, especially spaces associated with family survival and domestic safety. The psychological rupture. People no longer know where danger begins or ends. The home is breached. The ordinary tool becomes a weapon. The attacker remains unidentified. The control mechanism. A letter transforms private fear into public ritual. The behavioral evidence. Citizens reportedly respond by playing jazz, not because all are convinced, but because uncertainty makes non-compliance feel risky. The symbolic inversion. Jazz, normally associated with life, freedom, movement, improvisation, and pleasure, becomes temporarily converted into a survival behavior. The enduring psychological residue. The axe man becomes less a man than a pattern of how fear uses ambiguity, a pattern of how performance can magnify violence, a pattern of how people obey threats even when they cannot verify the source. And that is the mind bender. The Axeman did not need to be everywhere. He only needed New Orleans to imagine that he could be. The Axeman case teaches us something uncomfortable about human behavior. People do not only respond to facts, they respond to perceived threat. They respond to atmosphere. They respond to uncertainty. They respond to what might happen. That is why fear is so easy to weaponize. Certainty requires evidence. Fear only requires imagination. And imagination under pressure becomes obedient. This applies far beyond true crime. Institutions use it. Propaganda uses it. Manipulators use it. Abusers use it. Movements use it. Markets use it. Governments use it. The implied threat often controls behavior more efficiently than the actual punishment. The Axeman letter worked, or at least became legendary, because it understood one thing. A person does not need proof when the cost of being wrong feels unbearable. That is why people played music. That is why they listened. That is why silence became psychologically impossible. And that is why the Axeman remains with us. Not because we know his name, but because we recognize the mechanism, a hidden source, a public threat, a symbolic demand, a frightened population, a ritual of compliance. That is not just a crime story. That is social psychology in its darkest form. The Axeman of New Orleans was never conclusively caught. The attacks stopped. The city moved forward. The music continued. But something remained. A question. Simply, who was he? Not simply, why did he kill? But why did the city obey? That is the missing why. Because the most terrifying part of the Axeman's story may not be the axe. It may not even be the letter. It may be the realization that fear can compose behavior the way a musician composes sound. It can decide tempo. It can decide volume. It can decide when people gather, when they lock their doors, when they turn on the lights, when they play music into the night, because somewhere, perhaps nowhere, someone said silence could get them killed. The axe man turned New Orleans into an instrument, and for one night, the city played, not for joy, not for celebration, but because fear had taken the conductor's stand. This has been The Missing Why, where we do not examine true crime as spectacle. We examine it as behavioral anatomy, because beneath every crime is a structure. Beneath every structure is pressure. And beneath the pressure is the question most people avoid. Why? This was The Missing Why. If something felt off, it's because it was supposed to. Most people don't want clarity. They want coherence. Something that sounds right, even if it isn't. But the truth doesn't behave that way. It exposes. It disrupts. It forces you to confront the difference between what you believe and what's actually driving you. So before you move on, examine your own decisions. Not the version you explain to others, the one you avoid explaining to yourself. Because that's where everything starts. And whether you acknowledge it or not, it's already shaping what happens next.